The thunderous crack of gunfire pierced the night air as Beatrice Evans crouched behind the overturned wagon, clutching her Winchester rifle with white knuckles. She hadn't expected trouble on the journey to her uncle's ranch outside Porterville, Arizona territory, but the ambush had come swift and merciless. Now, all that remained of her escort lay scattered across the dusty trail, and the bandits who'd attacked them had disappeared into the darkness, taking her supplies and horses. All except one, her faithful border collie, Scout, who'd hidden in the brush during the attack. The year was 1885, and Beatrice B., to those who knew her, had traveled west from Boston following her parents' passing, hoping to start anew on her uncle's cattle ranch. At 22, she'd been sheltered from the harsh realities of frontier life, but the ambush had been a brutal introduction to the dangers of the untamed West. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the desert landscape in hues of gold and crimson, Bee gathered what little remained of her belongings. Her once fine traveling dress was torn and stained with dust, her chestnut hair falling loose from its pins. Scout emerged from his hiding place, pressing against her skirts with a worried whine. "We'll be all right, boy," she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "We just need to find help." According to the last milestone she'd passed, Porterville was still 15 miles northeast. With a deep breath, she adjusted her hat, slung her canteen over her shoulder, and began walking, Scout trotting faithfully by her side. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Bee trudged along the trail. By midday, her throat was parched, her lips cracked, and her fair skin burned despite the protection of her hat. Scout fared little better, his tongue lolling as he panted heavily beside her. "Just a little further," she encouraged, though she had no way of knowing how much ground they'd covered. The sound of hoofbeats behind her sent a jolt of fear through Bee's body. She spun around, raising her rifle with trembling hands. A lone rider approached, silhouetted against the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor. "Don't come any closer." She called out, her voice hoarse from thirst. The rider slowed his horse to a walk. "Madam, I don't mean any harm," a deep voice responded. As he drew nearer, Bee could make out a tall man astride a chestnut stallion. His face was partly shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was handsome, with a strong jawline covered in several days' stubble. "I'm Daniel Irwin," he said, tipping his hat. "I ranch about 5 miles north of here." Bee kept her rifle raised. "How do I know you're not with the men who attacked my wagon last night?" Daniel raised his hands slowly. "I'm just a rancher, madam. I was tracking some strays when I spotted you on the trail." His gaze softened as he noticed her disheveled state. "Looks like you've had some trouble." Scout growled low in his throat, positioning himself protectively in front of Bee. "Your dog's got good instincts," Daniel observed, "but I promise I'm here to help if you'll let me." Something in his steady gaze made Bee lower her rifle slightly. "I'm Beatrice Evans. My wagon was ambushed last night, the men who were escorting me." She swallowed hard. "They didn't make it." Daniel's expression darkened. "The Garrett gang, they've been terrorizing travelers on this stretch for months now." He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Evans." He offered her his canteen, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation, taking a grateful sip of the cool water. She poured some into her palm for Scout, who lapped it up eagerly. "I'm headed to my uncle's ranch near Porterville," she explained. "Robert Evans, do you know him?" A flicker of recognition crossed Daniel's face. "Big cattle operation about 10 miles east of town, I know of him." He paused, considering. "I can take you there, but first you both need rest and food. My place is closest." Bee hesitated, weighing her options. She was alone in unfamiliar territory, exhausted and dehydrated. Scout seemed to sense her indecision, and surprisingly, his aggressive stance relaxed as he cautiously approached Daniel, sniffing his boots. Daniel crouched slowly, offering his hand to the dog. "Hello there, fella." Scout gave his fingers a tentative lick, causing Daniel to smile. "Seems he's decided I'm trustworthy." Bee couldn't help but smile back. Scout was an excellent judge of character. He doesn't take to strangers easily. That's a good trait in these parts. Daniel straightened, gesturing to his horse. "My ranch is a couple hours' ride from here. You can rest, get some proper food, and I'll take you to your uncle's tomorrow." With Scout's apparent approval and her own exhaustion overwhelming her caution, Bee nodded. Daniel helped her mount his horse before swinging up behind her, keeping a respectful distance as he took the reins. Scout trotted alongside as they set off across the desert. Daniel's ranch was modest compared to what Bee had imagined her uncle's would be: a small main house built of timber and adobe, a barn, corral, and bunkhouse for the handful of men who worked for him. As they approached, two ranch hands emerged, looking curiously at Bee. "Found her on the South Trail," Daniel explained as he helped her dismount. "Garrett gang got her wagon." The men exchanged knowing glances. "They're getting bolder," one commented, taking the reins of Daniel's horse. "Miss Evans needs food and rest," Daniel said. "She's headed to Robert Evans' place." The men nodded, one tipping his hat respectfully to Bee before leading the horse away. Inside the house, Bee was surprised by the simple but comfortable furnishings. Daniel's housekeeper, a middle-aged Mexican woman named Sofia, clucked sympathetically at Bee's condition and immediately set about preparing a bath and meal while Daniel tactfully made himself scarce. After washing away the trail dust and changing into a simple dress Sofia provided, Bee felt revived enough to join Daniel for supper. Scout lay contentedly by the hearth, having already devoured a bowl of stew Sofia had prepared specially for him. "Your dog seems to have made himself at home," Daniel observed with a smile as Bee took her seat at the table. "Scout adapts quickly," she replied, "and he knows when he's among friends." Over a simple but hearty meal of venison stew, cornbread, and coffee, Bee learned more about her host. Daniel had come west from Virginia after the war, working as a cowhand until saving enough to purchase his small spread 5 years ago. He ran a modest herd and had a reputation for breeding fine horses. "And what brings a Boston lady to the Arizona Territory?" he asked, his blue eyes studying her with interest. Bee twirled her spoon in her stew, considering how much to share. "My parents died last winter influenza. There was nothing left for me in Boston, and Uncle Robert had always invited us to visit." She lifted her chin. "I decided it was time for a change." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "The West has a way of changing people, sometimes for the better. And sometimes not, if those bandits are any indication," she countered. "True enough. But for every outlaw, there are dozens of good, honest folk just trying to build a life out here." He refilled her coffee cup. "Your uncle's one of the successful ones. Started with nothing 15 years ago, now runs one of the biggest spreads in the territory." The next morning, Bee woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. After a substantial breakfast, Daniel saddled 2 horses, his chestnut stallion and a gentle mare for Bee. Scout seemed perfectly content to trot alongside as they set out for Robert Evans' ranch. The journey took them through breathtaking terrain, red rock formations, saguaro-dotted hillsides, and a winding creek that cut through the otherwise arid landscape. Daniel pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area, and Bee found herself increasingly drawn to his quiet strength and knowledge. By mid-afternoon, they crested a rise that overlooked a vast expanse of grassland dotted with cattle. In the distance, a substantial ranch house and outbuildings stood nestled against the foothills. "The Evans spread," Daniel announced. "Impressive, isn't it?" Bee nodded, a mixture of excitement and apprehension filling her. She hadn't seen her uncle since she was a child, and now she was arriving unannounced, having lost everything in the ambush. As they approached the main house, a tall, silver-haired man emerged onto the porch, shading his eyes against the sun. Recognition dawned on his weathered face, followed quickly by confusion and concern. "Beatrice, is that you, girl?" He hurried down the steps as they dismounted. "Uncle Robert," Bee managed before being enveloped in a bear hug that lifted her off her feet. "Good Lord, child. We weren't expecting you for another week." He set her down, his brow furrowing as he took in her borrowed clothes and the stranger beside her. "What's happened?" Bee explained the ambush as concisely as possible, introducing Daniel as her rescuer. Robert Evans' face darkened with anger at the mention of the Garrett gang, but he extended a hand to Daniel with genuine gratitude. "I can't thank you enough for helping my niece, Irwin. I've heard good things about your horse breeding operation." Daniel accepted the handshake with a modest nod. "Just did what anyone would do, Mr. Evans. Your niece is a brave woman, kept her wits about her in a situation that would have broken many." Robert turned back to Bee with obvious pride. "Evans' blood, we don't break easily." he whistled, and Scout bounded up to him, tail wagging. "And who's this fine fellow, Scout?" Bee answered, smiling as her uncle scratched the dog's ears. "He's been my companion since he was a pup." "Well, you're both home now," Robert declared, putting an arm around Bee's shoulders. He turned to Daniel. "You'll stay for supper at least." "It's the least I can do." Daniel hesitated, glancing at the sun's position. "I should get back before dark." "Nonsense," Robert interrupted. "Stay the night, we've plenty of room, and I want to hear more about these horses of yours, always looking to improve my stock." Before Daniel could protest further, Robert was leading them inside, calling for his housekeeper to prepare rooms and a special meal. Bee caught Daniel's eye and mouthed, "Thank you," as they entered the sprawling ranch house. The days that followed saw Bee settling into life at the Evans ranch. Her uncle had been a bachelor his entire life and seemed delighted to have family around. He insisted she make the place her home, giving her free rein to redecorate and organize as she saw fit. Scout quickly established himself as the ranch's unofficial guardian, accompanying the hands on their rounds and keeping the chicken coop free of predators. Daniel had returned to his own ranch the morning after their arrival, but not before accepting Robert's invitation to supply several horses for the Evans spread. This arrangement ensured his regular presence over the following weeks as he delivered animals and helped break them for the ranch hands. Bee found herself looking forward to his visits more than she cared to admit. There was something about his quiet confidence, his gentle way with animals, and his respectful manner that drew her to him. Unlike many of the men she'd met in Boston, Daniel seemed utterly without pretense. One warm afternoon in late June, Bee was in the garden behind the main house, tending to the vegetables and herbs she'd planted shortly after her arrival. Scout lay in the shade nearby, occasionally lifting his head to track the movements of butterflies flitting among the plants. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Scout to his feet, ears perked and tail wagging. Moments later, Daniel appeared around the corner of the house, leading his stallion. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing dark hair damp with sweat. "Miss Evans," he greeted her with a smile that made her heart skip. "Your uncle mentioned I might find you here." Bee wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of her work-worn appearance. "Mr. Irwin, I wasn't expecting you today." "I brought those Morgans your uncle was interested in," he explained, patting his horse's neck. "And please, it's Daniel. After all we've been through, Mr. Irwin seems too formal." Bee smiled, nodding. "Then you must call me Beatrice, or Bee, as my friends do." "Bee," he repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. His gaze lingered on her face, causing a warmth to spread through her that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. Scout broke the moment by trotting over to greet Daniel, who crouched to ruffle the dog's fur. "Hello again, Scout." "Keeping your mistress safe?" "He takes his duties very seriously," Bee laughed. "Though there's not much danger in a vegetable garden unless you count the rabbits that keep eyeing my carrots." Daniel straightened, gesturing to her garden. "It's impressive what you've accomplished in such a short time. Most newcomers take years to understand what will grow in this soil." "I've always had a knack for growing things," she admitted. "Back in Boston, my mother's garden was the envy of the neighborhood." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the soft whicker of Daniel's horse. Bee found herself studying his face the way the sun had deepened the tan on his skin, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he smiled. "Your uncle mentioned you might be interested in riding out to see the North Pasture," Daniel said finally. "The wildflowers are in bloom and it's quite a sight. I thought perhaps tomorrow if you're not otherwise engaged." The invitation hung in the air, carrying more weight than a simple ride. Bee felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. "I'd like that very much." Daniel's smile widened. "I'll come by after breakfast then." He replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. "Until tomorrow, Bee." She watched him lead his horse back around the house, Scout following part of the way before returning to her side. "Well," she said to the dog, "it seems we have plans for tomorrow." The following morning dawned clear and cooler than usual, a perfect day for riding. Bee dressed with care in a practical split riding skirt and crisp white blouse, her hair braided and pinned securely beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Scout pranced excitedly at her heels as she made her way to the stables where Daniel waited with two saddled horses. I hope you don't mind, he said, indicating Scout. Your uncle mentioned he follows you everywhere. He'd be heartbroken to be left behind, Bee confirmed, stroking her horse's velvet nose, though he'll keep his distance if the cattle make him nervous. They set off across the ranch, Scout running ahead to investigate interesting scents before circling back to check on them. Daniel proved to be an engaging guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the land's history. He knew the names of plants and animals Bee had never encountered, explaining their uses and habits with the ease of someone deeply connected to the natural world. As they rode farther from the ranch buildings, the landscape opened into rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers' brilliant splashes of purple, yellow, and red against the tawny backdrop. Bee gasped at the unexpected beauty. It's like an artist's palette, she breathed, reining in her horse to better appreciate the view. Daniel watched her reaction with evident pleasure. The desert keeps its treasures well hidden, you have to know where to look. They dismounted near a small stream that cut through the pasture, letting the horses drink while they stretched their legs. Daniel spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood, producing a small feast from his saddlebags: cold chicken, cornbread, fresh peaches, and a bottle of lemonade. You came prepared, Bee observed, settling onto the blanket. Daniel shrugged, a hint of color touching his cheeks. Sophia insisted. She said no lady should have to make do with jerky and hardtack on an outing. Their conversation flowed easily as they ate, discovering shared interests in books and music. Daniel revealed he'd been educated back east before the war diverted his plans, and Bee found his knowledge of literature surprising for a rancher. People out here aren't as uncultured as Easterners like to believe, he said with a wry smile. Though I admit, opportunities for Shakespeare performances are somewhat limited. Bee laughed, leaning back on her elbows to look up at the clouds scudding across the sky. I miss the theater sometimes and concerts, but I don't miss the stuffiness, the constant worry about propriety and appearances. Daniel studied her thoughtfully. You've adapted to life here more readily than most. Your uncle says you've taken to ranching as if you were born to it. It feels right somehow, she admitted. In Boston, I was always Robert Evans' odd niece who preferred gardens to gossip and books to balls. Here, she gestured to the open landscape around them, here I can breathe. Scout, who had been exploring the stream's edge, suddenly lifted his head, ears alert. A moment later, he barked sharply, racing toward a distant stand of trees. Scout, Bee called, rising quickly to her feet. Daniel was already up, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Stay here, he instructed, his voice low and serious, but Bee was already following her dog, concern overriding caution. Something's wrong, he never runs off like that. They hurried after Scout, whose barking had become more frantic. As they approached the trees, the acrid smell of smoke reached them, and Bee's heart began to pound. Through the branches, she could see flames licking at the dry underbrush, spreading quickly in the breeze. Scout stood at the edge of the growing fire, barking desperately at something beyond the flames. With horror, Bee realized what had caught his attention: a wolf pup, no more than a few months old, trapped on a rocky outcrop as the fire crept closer. Scout. She cried, lunging forward only to be caught firmly by Daniel's arm. Don't, he warned, pulling her back. The fire's moving too fast. Indeed, the flames were already consuming the dry grass between them and Scout, who continued barking at the trapped pup. Tears stung Bee's eyes. We can't leave them. Daniel's gaze swept the area, assessing the situation with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to emergencies. There's a gap in the fire line over there, he pointed. If we move quickly, we can circle around and reach them from the other side. Bee nodded, determination replacing fear. They hurried along the perimeter of the blaze, Daniel leading the way through a narrow passage where the fire hadn't yet taken hold. The smoke grew thicker as they approached the outcrop where the wolf pup cowered, whimpering. Scout stood his ground at the base of the rocks, refusing to abandon the frightened creature. Scout, come, Bee called, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. Daniel pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, gesturing for Bee to do the same with her neckerchief. The fire's closing in. We need to be quick. He studied the outcrop, then turned to Bee with a steadiness that calmed her racing heart. I'll climb up and get the pup. You call Scout to you and be ready to run back the way we came when I give the word. Without waiting for a response, Daniel began scaling the rocky face, moving with surprising agility for his size. Bee focused on Scout, who finally responded to her commands and reluctantly retreated to her side, though his eyes remained fixed on the trapped pup. Daniel reached the terrified animal, speaking to it in low, soothing tones as he carefully gathered it into one arm. The descent proved more difficult, especially with his precious cargo, but he managed it with only a few scrapes to show for his effort. "Now run," he shouted as his feet hit the ground. The pup clutched protectively to his chest. They raced back through the gap in the fire, which had narrowed dangerously in the short time they'd been on the other side. The smoke was disorienting, the heat intense, but Daniel kept a firm hold on Bee's hand, guiding her through. Scout bounded ahead, leading the way back to safety. When they finally emerged from the smoke, Bee doubled over, coughing and gulping clean air into her burning lungs. Daniel set the pup down, checking it for injuries while keeping a wary eye on the approaching fire. "We need to get back to the ranch," he said urgently. "This fire could spread across the whole north pasture if it's not contained." They hurried back to their horses, which had grown nervous with the smell of smoke. The wolf pup, trembling but apparently unharmed, was carefully tucked into Daniel's saddlebag, its head poking out. Scout kept pace alongside, seemingly satisfied that the rescue had been successful. As they galloped back toward the ranch, Bee glanced over at Daniel, his face smudged with soot. His expression determined, and felt something shift inside her. In that moment of crisis, seeing his courage and compassion, she realized she was falling in love with him. The ranch was already aware of the fire by the time they arrived. Smoke was visible for miles, and Robert had organized the hands to dig fire breaks and protect the cattle. Daniel immediately joined the efforts, explaining the fire's location and direction while Bee took charge of the rescued pup, bathing its smoke-stained fur and checking for burns or injuries. "You've got yourself an unusual pet," her uncle commented when he found her tending to the tiny wolf in the kitchen. "Scout found him," Bee explained, recounting their adventure. Daniel didn't hesitate, he just climbed right up to save him, even with the fire closing in. Robert studied his niece's face with knowing eyes. "Irwin's a good man, one of the best in these parts." Bee felt color rise in her cheeks. "He is," she agreed softly. It was past midnight when the men returned, exhausted but successful in containing the fire. A fortunate shift in the wind had helped their efforts, pushing the blaze back toward areas that had already burned. The north pasture had suffered damage, but the ranch buildings and most of the grazing land had been spared. Daniel looked dead on his feet as he accepted a cup of coffee from Bee, his face and clothes blackened with soot. "How's the pup?" he asked, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Sleeping," she replied, nodding toward a makeshift bed near the hearth where the wolf cub lay curled beside a watchful Scout. "No burns, just frightened and hungry. I gave him some milk and meat scraps." "Good." He sank into a chair, wincing slightly. Bee noticed a tear in his shirt sleeve, revealing an angry red burn beneath. "You're hurt," she said, immediately moving to examine the injury. "It's nothing," he tried to dismiss, but she was already gathering supplies to treat it. Her fingers were gentle as she cleaned and dressed the burn, her touch lingering perhaps longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving Scout and the pup, for everything." Daniel caught her hand as she finished tying the bandage. "Your dog barked at the fire's edge. I couldn't leave him there or the pup." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "We saved him together." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been building since their first meeting on the trail. Before either could find words for it, Robert entered the kitchen, breaking the spell. "Fire's out for good," he announced, pouring himself coffee. "Lost about 20 acres of grazing land, but it could have been much worse." He clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "You're staying here tonight, Irwin, no arguing. You're in no condition to ride home, and your horse needs rest as much as you do." Daniel nodded gratefully, too exhausted to protest. As he was shown to a guest room, his gaze lingered on Bee, carrying a promise of conversations yet to come. The fire marked a turning point. In the days that followed, Daniel became a more frequent visitor at the Evans ranch, ostensibly to check on the recovery of the damaged pasture and to help with repairs to fencing. The wolf pup, which Bee named Ember in recognition of his fiery rescue, became a fixture at the ranch, following Scout everywhere and quickly adapting to domesticated life. July brought scorching temperatures and the threat of drought. The creek that supplied water to both the Evans and Irwin ranches began to run dangerously low, prompting Robert to call a meeting of local ranchers to discuss water conservation. It was at this gathering that rumors began to circulate about the Garrett gang's return to the area. "They hit the Taylor place last week," one rancher reported grimly. "Took everything of value and shot John Taylor when he tried to stop them. He'll live, but barely." A murmur of anger passed through the assembled men. Bee, who had insisted on attending the meeting despite her uncle's reservations, felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach at the mention of the outlaws who had killed her escort. "The territorial marshal's been notified," Robert said, "but we all know how stretched thin they are. In the meantime, I suggest we increase our vigilance. No one should ride alone, especially the women and younger hands." Bee caught Daniel's concerned glance from across the room and lifted her chin slightly, silently reassuring him she would be careful. Since the fire, something had shifted between them, a deepening of trust and understanding that made words often unnecessary. As the meeting dispersed, Daniel sought her out. "I'll be checking my north boundary line tomorrow," he said. "It runs along your uncle's property. Would you like to ride with me? Bring Scout and Ember, of course." The invitation was practical on the surface, safety in numbers, but Bee recognized the underlying desire to spend time together. "I'd like that," she replied with a smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. The following morning found them riding along the boundary between their properties, Scout and Ember racing ahead in a game of chase that had become their favorite pastime. The wolf pup had grown considerably in the weeks since his rescue, his wild heritage evident in his rangy build and keen senses, though he remained utterly devoted to Scout and Bee. "He's going to be magnificent when he's fully grown," Daniel observed as Ember loped back to check on them before dashing off again. "Scout's been a good influence," Bee said proudly. "Though I worry about when Ember gets older. Will he want to return to his own kind?" Daniel considered this. "Perhaps, but animals can form strong bonds across species. Look at horses and cattle, natural prey animals that learn to trust humans." He glanced at her with a smile. Some connections transcend what seems natural or expected. The significance of his words wasn't lost on Bee. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had anticipated that day on the trail, crossing boundaries of background and experience. They stopped to rest in the shade of a rocky overhang near a small pool fed by a spring, one of the few water sources that hadn't dried up in the heat. As they shared a simple lunch, Daniel grew uncharacteristically quiet, seeming to wrestle with his thoughts. "Is something troubling you?" Bee finally asked. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Daniel set aside his canteen, turning to face her fully. "I've been thinking about the future," he began carefully. "My ranch is doing well, but it's isolated. The work is hard and the days can be long." Bee nodded, uncertain where he was heading with this observation. "What I mean to say is," he continued, his usual confidence faltering, "a man shouldn't face such a life alone, not if he has a choice." Her heart began to beat faster as his meaning became clear. "And does this particular man have a choice in mind?" she asked softly. Daniel reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Bee, I know we haven't known each other long by Eastern standards. Out here, people measure time differently, by seasons, by cattle drives, by the challenges weathered together." His blue eyes held her steadily. "In the short time I've known you, you've shown more courage and adaptability than most show in a lifetime. I admire you more than I can say." "Daniel," she began, but he pressed on. "I'm not a wealthy man, and my home isn't grand like your uncle's. But it's mine, free and clear, and there's room for it to grow." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to ask, not very eloquently, is if you might consider sharing that home with me, as my wife." The directness of his proposal took her breath away, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Daniel wasn't a man to speak in riddles or play games. His honesty was one of the qualities she'd come to cherish most. Before she could respond, the distant sound of gunfire shattered the moment. Scout and Ember immediately ceased their play, ears perked toward the sound. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to his revolver. That came from the direction of your uncle's ranch, he said grimly. Fear clutched at Bee's heart as they hurried to their horses. The ride back was tense, both of them scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. As they crested the final rise overlooking the ranch, they saw several riders circling the main house while smoke rose from one of the outbuildings. "The Garrett gang," Daniel muttered, drawing his rifle from its saddle holster. "Stay here, I'll go for help." "No," Bee caught his arm. "Uncle Robert is down there, I won't hide while he's in danger." Daniel studied her determined face, then nodded sharply. "Stay close to me. We'll circle around to the back of the house where they won't see us approach." They dismounted, leaving the horses concealed behind a stand of junipers. Scout and Ember followed silently as they made their way on foot through the brush, keeping low to avoid detection. As they neared the back of the ranch house, the sounds of shouting became clearer. "Evans, we know you're in there," a harsh voice called. "Send out the girl and maybe we'll let you live." Ice ran through Bee's veins. They were looking for her. "They must have realized you survived the ambush," Daniel whispered as they crouched behind the smokehouse. "You're a witness who could identify them." Bee peered around the edge of the building. 5 men on horseback surrounded the house, while 2 more stood on the porch, one holding a torch. The barn was already ablaze, and several of the ranch hands lay motionless in the yard. Of her uncle, there was no sign. "Uncle Robert must be inside," she whispered. "We need to create a diversion, draw them away from the house." Daniel nodded grimly. "I count 7 of them, too many to take on directly." Scout nudged Bee's hand, whining softly. Beside him, Ember's hackles were raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he sensed the danger. An idea formed in Bee's mind. "Scout, Ember," she whispered, calling both animals close. The bond between woman and animals was almost tangible as she spoke quietly to them, pointing toward the corral where the horses were penned. Daniel watched with amazement as both dog and wolf seemed to understand her intent, slinking off through the underbrush toward the corral. "What are you planning?" he asked. "A stampede," Bee replied, her eyes following the animal's progress. "When the horses break free, the outlaws will have to scatter. It might give us enough time to reach the house." Daniel's admiration was evident in his expression. "Remind me never to underestimate you," he murmured, readying his rifle. They waited tensely until Scout and Ember reached the corral. The wolf pup, despite his youth, had inherited his wild ancestors' ability to spark fear in domestic animals. Together with Scout, he slipped into the pen and began darting among the horse's legs, barking and growling. The effect was immediate. The already nervous horses, smelling smoke and sensing danger, panicked. With a thunderous crash, they broke through the corral fence and surged toward the open range directly through the yard where the Garrett gang had gathered. Chaos erupted as the outlaws fought to control their own mounts amid the stampede. Daniel seized the moment, firing precise shots that found 2 of the men before they even realized they were under attack. Bee raced toward the house, Daniel close behind her, using the confusion as cover. They burst through the kitchen door to find Robert crouched by a window, rifle in hand, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. Relief washed over his face at the sight of them. "Beatrice, thank God," he exclaimed. "They came out of nowhere, demanding to know where you were." "How bad are you hurt?" she asked, quickly examining his wound. "Just grazed, I'll live." He nodded toward the front of the house. Most of the boys scattered when the shooting started. Anderson and Miller were hit before they could reach cover. Daniel peered cautiously out a window. "The stampede scattered them, but they'll regroup soon. We need to get out of here while we can." A fusillade of bullets suddenly splintered the window frame, sending them diving for cover. "Too late for that," Robert grimaced. "They know you're here now." The standoff continued as afternoon stretched into evening. The outlaws, reduced to 5 after Daniel's precise shooting, maintained their positions around the house, occasionally firing to keep those inside pinned down. Inside, Bee tended to her uncle's wound while Daniel conserved their ammunition, taking carefully aimed shots only when a clear target presented itself. As darkness fell, Scout and Ember returned, slipping in through a partially open window. Bee embraced them both, relieved they had survived the chaos they'd helped create. "Smart animals," Robert commented weakly. He had grown pale from blood loss despite Bee's efforts to stanch the wound. A tense quiet descended, broken only by occasional shouts from the outlaws demanding their surrender. Daniel used the respite to confer with Robert about the house's defensive positions and potential escape routes. "The root cellar," Robert suggested. "There's an old tunnel that leads to the creek bed. Had it dug during the Apache troubles years back. Never thought I'd need it again." Daniel nodded. "I'll check it out. If it's passable, we can move under cover of full darkness." While he investigated the escape route, Bea changed her uncle's bandages and helped him drink some water. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "They came for me." Robert squeezed her hand. "None of that, girl. Your family, worth fighting for." Daniel returned with mixed news. "The tunnel's intact, but it's narrow. We'll have to move single file, and it'll be a tight squeeze for a man my size." He glanced at Scout and Ember. "The animals can manage, but we'll need to keep them calm." A plan was formed. They would wait until midnight when attention might flag among their attackers, then slip away through the tunnel. If successful, they could reach the creek bed and follow it to neighboring ranch for help. As they prepared, gathering what supplies they could carry, Bea found a moment alone with Daniel in the kitchen. "About your question earlier," she said softly, before we were interrupted. Daniel paused in checking his revolver, his eyes meeting hers in the dim lamplight. "This isn't exactly how I imagined awaiting your answer," he said with a wry smile. Bea stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "I don't need more time to consider. My answer is yes, Daniel Irwin. I would be honored to be your wife." In the midst of danger, the certainty of her feelings had only crystallized more clearly. "Provided we survive the night, of course." Daniel's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. "We'll survive," he promised. "I've got too much to live for now." His kiss was gentle yet fervent, sealing their commitment amidst the unlikeliest of circumstances. The moment was broken by Robert clearing his throat from the doorway, a knowing smile softening his haggard features. "If you two are quite finished making plans, it's nearly time to move." The escape through the tunnel was harrowing. Robert, weakened by his wound, struggled to navigate the narrow passage, requiring Daniel's support. Scout and Ember moved silently ahead, their superior night vision guiding the way. Bea followed, carrying what supplies they'd managed to salvage along with her uncle's prized Winchester. They had nearly reached the exit when a distant shout echoed through the tunnel their absence had been discovered. Daniel urged them forward with renewed urgency, helping Robert through the tunnel's exit into the dry creek bed beyond. The night sky provided little illumination as clouds had moved in, obscuring the stars and moon. This worked in their favor, making it harder for their pursuers to track them as they stumbled along the rocky creek bed. Scout and Ember ranged ahead, occasionally returning to ensure the humans followed. They had covered perhaps a mile when Robert stumbled, his strength finally giving out. "Go on," he gasped as Daniel caught him. "I'll only slow you down." "We're not leaving you," Bea said firmly, helping Daniel lower her uncle to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging bank. "We rest here just for a moment." The sound of pursuit grew closer, hoofbeats and voices carrying in the still night air. The outlaws had discovered the tunnel's exit and were now following the creek bed. "They'll be on us soon," Daniel muttered, checking his ammunition. "I'll try to hold them off while you get your uncle to safety." "No," Bea gripped his arm. "We stay together." A low growl from Ember alerted them to approaching danger. The wolf pup's eyes gleamed in the darkness as he stared intently back the way they had come. Beside him, Scout's posture mirrored his companion's, both animals sensing the threat before human ears could detect it. Daniel positioned himself at the edge of their shelter, rifle ready. Bea took up her uncle's Winchester, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Robert, despite his weakened state, drew his revolver, determined to make a stand. The first outlaw appeared as a shadow against the slightly lighter backdrop of the creek bed. Daniel's rifle cracked and the man fell without a sound. Immediately, gunfire erupted from multiple positions as the remaining gang members sought cover. "There's at least 4 of them," Daniel whispered, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering another round. The firefight that ensued was brief but intense. Bullets whined overhead and thudded into the earth around them as both sides exchanged fire in the darkness. Bea fired with deliberate precision, just as her father had taught her years ago on hunting trips in the Maine woods. Her shot found one of the attackers, eliciting a cry of pain that echoed along the creek bed. Just as it seemed they might be overwhelmed, new gunfire erupted from behind the outlaws' position precise, disciplined shots that sent the Garrett gang scrambling for cover. Voices called out commands, and the sound of multiple horses approached rapidly. U.S. Marshal, throw down your weapons. The outlaws, caught in a crossfire, had little choice. Within minutes, the shooting had stopped, replaced by the sounds of men being disarmed and restrained. Evans. You down there, a voice called out. Marshal Davis, Robert responded weakly. A lantern flared, revealing several mounted men wearing badges leading the captured outlaws. The marshal, a grizzled veteran of the frontier, dismounted and approached their shelter. Thought we might find you in the thick of it, Evans, he said, extending a hand to help the wounded rancher to his feet. Got word from one of your hands who escaped the attack, said the Garrett gang had hit your place. While Robert was helped onto a horse, Bea turned to Daniel, the relief of their survival washing over her. Without words, they embraced, holding each other tightly as the tension of the past hours finally released. I believe, Daniel murmured against her hair, we were discussing wedding plans before we were so rudely interrupted. Bea laughed, the sound slightly hysterical with relief. Yes, I believe we were, Mr. Irwin. Scout and Ember circled around them, seemingly pleased with the outcome of the night's adventure. The wolf pup, growing more confident by the day, even allowed the marshal to cautiously pat his head, a sign of his increasing comfort with humans beyond his adopted family. The journey back to the Evans ranch was slow out of consideration for Robert's condition. By the time they arrived, dawn was breaking over the eastern hills, illuminating the damage wrought by the attack. The barn was a smoldering ruin, and bullet holes pocked the main house, but the structure itself remained intact. Several of the ranch hands who had escaped the initial assault had returned and were already beginning cleanup efforts. Their faces registered shock and then relief at the sight of their employer returning alive, accompanied by the marshal's posse and the captured outlaws. Robert was taken inside to have his wound properly treated by the town doctor, who had been summoned along with the marshal. The members of the Garrett gang were secured in the bunkhouse under guard until they could be transported to the territorial prison. Marshal Davis approached Bea and Daniel as they stood surveying the damage in the early morning light. Miss Evans, I'll need your statement about the ambush on your wagon. With your testimony and what happened here, the Garretts won't see freedom again. Bea nodded, her hand finding Daniel's for support. I'll tell you everything I remember, Marshal. The marshal's weathered face softened slightly. You showed remarkable courage, both of you. Not many would have attempted what you did last night. He glanced at Scout and Ember, who were investigating the damage to their territory with canine thoroughness. Interesting companions you have there. They saved our lives, Daniel said simply. Both at the fire and last night. After the marshal departed to arrange transport for his prisoners, Daniel turned to Bea, taking both her hands in his. I should return to my ranch, check that everything's in order, but I'll be back tomorrow if that's acceptable. More than acceptable, she replied, reluctant to let him go but understanding his responsibilities. We have plans to make, after all. His smile warmed her more effectively than the rising sun. Indeed we do, Miss Evans, indeed we do. The weeks that followed were filled with recovery and rebuilding. Robert's wound healed cleanly, though the doctor warned it would trouble him in cold weather for years to come. The burned barn was replaced with a sturdier structure, and the bullet-riddled sections of the house were repaired. True to his word, Daniel returned the following day and nearly every day thereafter. His proposal was formally repeated to Robert, who gave his blessing with evident pleasure. Plans for an autumn wedding began to take shape, with Bea insisting on a simple ceremony at the ranch rather than in town. This land brought us together, she explained to Daniel as they rode the boundary between their properties, now with an eye toward how they might eventually join the two ranches. It seems right to make our vows here. August passed into September, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of fall color to the landscape. The date was set for early October when the worst heat had passed, but before winter's chill descended on the territory. As the wedding day approached, Bee found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her west. The ambush that had seemed like such a tragedy had set in motion the events that led her to Daniel. The fire that threatened destruction had instead cemented their bond. Even the attack on the ranch, terrifying as it was, had clarified the depth of their commitment to each other. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and crisp, with just enough breeze to rustle the decorations Bee and Sophia had hung throughout the ranch yard. A simple arch of local wildflowers and cottonwood branches stood before the backdrop of the mountains, where the ceremony would take place. In her room, Bee prepared with Sophia's help, donning a gown of ivory silk that had been ordered from San Francisco. It was simpler than what she might have worn for a Boston wedding, but perfectly suited to her new life and sensibilities. A soft scratch at the door was followed by Scout's distinctive whine. Sophia opened it to admit both dog and wolf pup, now nearly adolescent in size. Scout carried something in his mouth, which he proudly presented to be a small bouquet of desert wildflowers, carefully tied with a ribbon. "Did Daniel put you up to this?" she asked, kneeling to accept the gift. Scout's wagging tail was answer enough. When she finally emerged onto the porch where her uncle waited to escort her to the ceremony, Bee's heart swelled at the sight that greeted her. Not only had the neighbors from surrounding ranches come to witness the union, but several of the townspeople from Porterville had made the journey as well, including the marshal and the doctor who had treated Robert's wound. And there, waiting beneath the flower arch with the preacher, stood Daniel, clean-shaven and dressed in a new suit, his usually tanned face slightly pale with nerves. When he caught sight of her, however, his expression transformed into one of such complete adoration that Bee felt tears prick at her eyes. Scout and Ember preceded her down the makeshift aisle, both animals impeccably groomed for the occasion. They took their places beside Daniel, as if understanding their importance in the couple's story. Robert squeezed Bee's hand as they reached the arch. "Your parents would be so proud," he whispered before placing her hand in Daniel's. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, the couple exchanging vows they had written themselves. Daniel spoke of finding unexpected treasure in the desert, of courage that inspired him, and of a future built on mutual respect and deepening love. Bee promised steadfastness through all seasons, partnership in all endeavors, and a home filled with the warmth they'd found in each other. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's kiss was both tender and possessive, a public declaration of the private bond they'd forged through fire and danger. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under the stars. Even Scout and Ember joined the festivities, accepting treats from guests and occasionally performing the tricks Bee had taught them to the delight of the children present. As night fell and the party continued, Daniel led Bee away from the crowd to a quiet spot near the garden she had cultivated. In the silver moonlight, he presented her with a small wooden box. "A wedding gift," he explained as she opened it to reveal a delicately crafted silver pendant in the shape of a wolf. "It's beautiful," she breathed, allowing him to fasten it around her neck. "To remember how we began," he said softly. "Your dog barked at the fire's edge and you said we'd save him together," she finished, her fingers tracing the pendant. "Little did we know we were saving ourselves as well." Daniel drew her close, his arms encircling her waist. "That day changed everything for me. I'd been content enough with my solitary life until then, but after meeting you..." He shook his head slightly. "I couldn't imagine returning to it." Bee leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid strength of him. "We have a lifetime ahead of us now," she murmured. "A lifetime of saving each other, I expect." His chuckle rumbled against her cheek. "I look forward to every minute of it, Mrs. Irwin." The years that followed proved both challenging and rewarding for the newly formed Irwin family. Their first winter as husband and wife brought heavy snows that tested the resources of both ranches, but they weathered it together, emerging in spring with plans to expand their operations. Daniel's expertise with horses complemented Robert's cattle knowledge, allowing them to diversify in ways neither had attempted alone. Bee's garden expanded into a productive orchard that soon supplied fruit not only for their households, but for sale in Porterville as well. Scout and Ember remained inseparable companions, the bond between dog and wolf a continuous source of amazement to visitors. As Ember matured, his wolf heritage became more pronounced in his appearance, though his behavior remained that of a loyal ranch dog. Occasionally, during full moons, he would howl hauntingly, and Scout would join him in a duet that echoed across the valley. The spring of 1887 brought their first child, a son they named James Robert, after both their fathers. He was born during a thunderstorm that broke a month-long drought, a coincidence Robert declared was a sign of good fortune. Scout and Ember appointed themselves the baby's guardians, sleeping beside his cradle and alerting Bee to his cries even before she heard them herself. As Porterville grew from a frontier outpost into a proper town, complete with a school and regular stage coach service, Daniel and Bee became respected figures in the community. Their combined ranch, now known simply as Irwin Evans, employed many local men and was known for fair treatment of workers regardless of background, a policy that sometimes raised eyebrows but earned deep loyalty among their hands. 2 more children followed James, a daughter, Catherine, in 1889, and another son, Michael, in 1892. The Irwin children grew up on horseback, learning ranching skills alongside their schoolwork and inheriting their parents' love of the land and its creatures. Robert, though slowed by age and his old wound, remained an integral part of the family, delighting in his role as grandfather and continuing to offer guidance on the cattle operation well into his 70s. One cool autumn evening in 1895, 10 years after Bee's arrival in the territory, the family gathered on the wide porch of the main house, now expanded to accommodate their growing family. Daniel and Bee sat side by side in rocking chairs, watching their children play in the yard with the newest generation of dogs descended from Scout's line. Ember, now an elderly wolf with graying muzzle but still dignified bearing, lay at Bee's feet, his golden eyes following the children's movements. "Do you ever miss Boston?" Daniel asked, a question he hadn't posed in years. Bee's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity of long marriage. "Not for a moment," she replied truthfully. "Everything I need is right here." Her gaze swept over the ranch buildings, the distant mountains tinged pink with sunset, and finally rested on her husband's face, more lined now than when they'd met, but still handsome, still capable of making her heart skip with a certain smile. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked softly. "When you found me on the trail after the ambush," Daniel nodded, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "You were pointing that rifle at me with the steadiest hands I'd ever seen on someone who looked about ready to collapse from exhaustion." Bee laughed at the memory. "I was terrified you were with the Garrett gang. And now look at us," he mused. 3 children, 2,000 head of cattle, the finest horses in the territory, and enough dogs to start our own pack. All because Scout barked at a fire and you were brave enough to help us," she said, leaning over to kiss his cheek. As if recognizing his name in the conversation, the elderly border collie raised his head from where he dozed near Ember. Though slowed by age, his eyes were still bright with intelligence, his devotion to be undiminished by the years. Daniel smiled at the old dog. He knew a good thing when he saw it, smarter than his master, who took a bit longer to realize what treasure he'd found. Bee squeezed his hand, remembering all they'd faced together: droughts and blizzards, cattle rustlers and market crashes, the joys of children born and the sorrows of friends lost. Through it all, their partnership had only strengthened, tempered like steel in fire. "We saved each other," she said simply. As twilight deepened into night and their children were called in for supper, Bee and Daniel remained on the porch a moment longer, watching the first stars appear in the vast Arizona sky. Scout and Ember rose stiffly to follow the family inside, maintaining their lifelong vigil. The ranch was quiet save for the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves. In that peaceful moment, Bee thought back to the frightened young woman who had arrived in this wild territory a decade earlier and marveled at the journey that had brought her home. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts, drawing her close as they finally turned to go inside. "You know," he said with a smile that still had the power to warm her from within, "I think we're still saving each other every single day." And as they entered the warmth of their home, surrounded by the family they had built together. Bea knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't have it any other way.